I'm going to look for a job and get someplace to live, he told her. As soon as I'm able, we'll get the family together. He went to a red brick rooming house at 1026 North Beckley Avenue in nearby suburban Oak Cliff and rented a tiny cubicle of a room. He gave his name falsely as O.H. Lee and paid a week's rent, $8 in advance. Hello, you guys. Welcome back to my channel. And if you're new, then welcome. I would love to earn your subscription with this video. My name is Connelly, and on this channel, we do read-alongs through history, mostly. Occasionally, we do little fun things like we're doing right now. We're going through the Duggar family secrets that were exposed in the documentary, Shiny Happy People. So we are in the middle of that right now, but we have read books about the Kennedys. We have done lots of Life and Look magazines. We have spent a lot of time looking into eyewitness accounts of the JFK assassination. We did a lot of that in late April 2025. So if you are interested in that, go ahead and go back to that playlist. I have a playlist all about the assassination and one all about the Kennedys. And so there's tons to learn there. But I actually just now made an executive decision. I was going to start going through some of my LBJ magazines with you guys because I do have a lot, and we are going to do that. I have the magazines that are basically how he was introduced to the nation and how in that first year of his presidency he was perceived by the people and presented by Life magazine. So I do intend to do that with you. And I actually was going to do this article right here called Lyndon Johnson, the 36th President. Now, you may not realize this. This is the Life magazine that was the first print immediately following the assassination. It just doesn't have the cover. And this is the copy I happened to get. If I was out now and I didn't own this magazine, I would buy the one with the cover. But this is one that I happened to pick up. A guy had a whole bunch of JFK things in a storage building, and we went out and met him one day, and this was one of the things. And I didn't realize what I had until I got home because it was just, oh yes, I'll take that, that sounds good. Well, this was the Life magazine immediately following. And this is the one that has the Zapruder images. If you remember, the Zapruder film was not seen by the American public until 1975. And actually, just a couple days ago, I was able to meet with the man who was responsible for that. Robert Groden is the one who took the Zapruder film and shared it on Good Night America with Geraldo Rivera in 1975. But prior to that, this is what people had seen. It was the split-second sequence of the frame-by-frame look of the Zapruder film. Now, Mr. Zapruder was standing up in that structure in Dealey Plaza on a pillar, and he filmed that whole sequence. And so this was what was presented to the American people. It's very grainy, but you can see President Kennedy emerging from the sign. He's got his hands up to his throat. They did not show the fatal shots. That was part of what we're told Mr. Zapruder had arranged. So people did not, until 1975, see the Zapruder film with the full view of the fatal headshots. But we got throughout this magazine, we've gone through it before, so you want to look in November of 2024 was when we went through that actual whole article. It shows things like this moment with Lyndon Johnson, etc. It's hard not to pause as I go through this. But today, instead of going through the LBJ article yet, we'll get to that soon. You guys let me know in the comments how interested you are in the LBJ account, because on the one hand, I feel a lot of animosity toward LBJ. I don't trust that his motives were entirely pure. I don't know 100%, of course, that he was involved, although even the recent audio files from Billy Saul Estes make it seem that he did hire Mac Wallace to assassinate the president. But regardless of that, I have just a general animosity toward him. But as we read in these articles about the Bobby Baker scandal, this was 2 weeks before the assassination on November 8th. This was the literal magazine that was printed the day of the JFK assassination. These two together told the story of the Bobby Baker bombshell. People believe that these articles were fed to Life magazine by RFK, and that JFK was thinking of removing LBJ from the ticket. So just that knowledge in general, and then that he immediately becomes the president, is enough to make me not feel great warmth toward the man. But he is one of our presidents, and I would like to learn more. So let me know in the comments if you're interested. But instead today we are going to talk about the first look that people got at this man, because of course this magazine, published 1 week after the assassination, was focused on the president. It was focused on his assassination. It showed the Zapruder film images. It showed the new president taking the oath of office. But also simultaneously, because Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested, and then within 2 days he was dead, the information that people were getting was all simultaneous. They just got information about Lee at the same time that they got information about the assassination. So let's read this article. It's called Assassin: The Man Held and Killed for Murder. The caption for the photo says, "In Dallas City Jail, Jack Ruby levels his gun at Lee Oswald an instant before he pulled the trigger. Oswald died in the hospital where the president died, as the president lay in state in the nation's capital." This article is by a man named Thomas Thompson. The incredible event had an incredible sequel. Lee Harvey Oswald, held as the assassin of President Kennedy, was being taken from a Dallas jail when a man stepped up, shot, and killed him. The avenger was Jack Ruby, owner of a Dallas nightclub. The assassination of President Kennedy, the crime charged to Lee Harvey Oswald, must have been the act of a man who, for a long time, had harbored wild thoughts, but had kept them hidden, churning deep within himself. So we are given a look at their description of Lee. A man who for a long time had harbored wild thoughts, but had kept them hidden, churning deep within himself. They're definitely setting the stage for the lone gunman theory here in week 1. There was much in Lee's history, in his angry and disorganized intelligence, that would point toward the deed that would horrify the world. His father, Robert, an insurance salesman, dropped dead of a heart attack in the summer of 1939. Lee was born in October. So his mother was pregnant when his father dropped dead. Interesting. His handsome blonde mother, Marguerite Oswald, had 2 older sons to support besides the infant Lee, and only $3,000 from a small insurance policy, most of which went towards medical and burial bills. Times were hard, and Mrs. Oswald sold their small frame house. She began a dreary succession of badly paying jobs in New Orleans, New York, and Texas. When Lee was 5, they were living in Fort Worth, and even then, he was swimming against the current. Other kids teased him because he was so bright, his mother remembered after his arrest. And near hysteria, she still summoned every ounce of a mother's will to remember only the good things about her son. He learned to read by himself, she said, before he even went to school. He was always wanting to know about important things. Teachers and classmates remember Lee as a loner, bookish and introspective, resentful of discipline. When he was about 15, a key event in his life took place. From somewhere, he obtained a pamphlet about the Rosenberg spy case. It was a passionate argument that the 2 Russian spies were innocent and had been railroaded to the electric chair. "I still remember that pamphlet," he said in later years. "Then I discovered one book in the library, Karl Marx's Das Kapital. It was what I'd been looking for. It was like a very religious man opening the Bible for the first time." That's an interesting comparison for him to make. Frequently, Lee came home with torn clothes and a bloody nose. He admitted that he had been fighting, but he wouldn't tell his mother. You don't understand, and they don't understand. Just before his 17th birthday, he entered the 10th grade at Arlington Heights High School in Fort Worth. He was always bored and restless in school, his mother says. He used to come home and say, I already know all the stuff they're teaching. Why bother with that? Then he'd go off to the library and read, not trivial things, deep stuff, histories, biographies, politics. The school couldn't interest him. Nowadays, they have special classes for gifted students. Not then. If Lee Oswald's intelligence was above average, his report cards were not. He was getting mostly C's and D's and was in danger of failing when he came home one day and told his mother that he was going to enlist in the Marine Corps. You know, it's interesting. We have a different perspective on this now, but sometimes smart kids do get C's and D's when they don't care about material. I mean, this almost sounds like somebody who's ADHD, now people call it. Just distractible, interested in lots of different things, very bright. And the other thing I think is that they're not going into the quantity of moves that happened in his young life, but that also can cause a disinterest in school when you don't have familiarity with your teachers and with your peers, and you maybe are getting teased or bullied, which it sounds like was happening. So the C's and D's is like actually pretty great if you are moving constantly and being bullied constantly. He's still basically skimming along without much effort, it sounds like, which does sound potentially like a very bright person. I just want to do something different, he said. Mrs. Oswald wept as he went off. He was trained at camps in the U.S. and then shipped to Japan as an electronics technician. His letters to his mother indicate that he was alternatively content and dissatisfied with the Marines. This makes me laugh. If you don't know, my oldest son is a Marine. And the Marines are the hardest working branch of our military. They, of course, can go by land, by air, or by sea. And they have to learn, all of them have to learn riflery and shooting. All of them go through physical combat training. They are very elite fighters. And you do get very intense training that can simultaneously leave you feeling like a very well-trained Marine and also like a very disgruntled underling. So this doesn't surprise me at all. I think probably every Marine expresses the mix of those two things of contentment and dissatisfaction with the Marines because of how hard they work you. He did not tell her that he had stood 2 courts-martial, one for failing to register a pistol and the other for getting into a row with a non-com. He was a good Marine, claims Mrs. Oswald. He got the Good Conduct Medal and he participated in that Formosa business. He fought hard for his country. Some of those who served with him, however, remember him in a different light. We were trained to work as a team, recalled one, but Oswald seemed to be different. He was always separate from most of the men and didn't have any close friends that I remember. Another mentions Oswald's bitterness at the tough time his mother had had when he was a small child. My understanding is that he had been, because she couldn't afford to feed them at various times, that she would check them into boys' homes, like orphanages, intermittently. And so that was also part of the unreliable childhood that he had, was just not being able to even know for sure that he was living with his own mom. So that would produce bitterness. While Lee was in Japan, Mrs. Oswald reached up for a heavy candy carton one day in the store where she worked. The box toppled down and struck her in the head. She was in bed for 6 months and very quickly was destitute. Lee, who had by that time returned to California with still another year to go on his hitch, obtained a special hardship discharge to provide for her. He came home for exactly 3 days. What Mrs. Oswald did not know, what nobody knew, was that a cancerous idea now totally absorbed the mind of her strange and withdrawn son. The seeds planted by the Rosenberg pamphlet had germinated. Lee had become enchanted by communism. He went to New Orleans, got a job on a freighter, and 1 month later, in October 1959, turned up in Russia, announced that he announcing that he wished to give up his American citizenship and become a Russian citizen. I just went back to my little shelf. I had this book called Legend, The Secret World of Lee Harvey Oswald by Edward J. Epstein. And I knew that it could shed some light on this for us. And so I'm just going to read a short passage from it because my understanding is different than this. And I just want to share this little bit that I'm aware of before we keep reading this article. So he had gone home. It says, on the morning of September 16th, Oswald showed his mother his passport. She remembers noticing a page stamped import, export, and left for New Orleans after giving her $100. He had stored most of his belongings in his brother's garage. The next day in New Orleans, he went to a travel consultant and he did book passage on a freighter. It says that he was in France and then Britain on October 8th and October 9th. And then it says the last witnesses to identify Oswald before he appeared in Moscow 1 week later was there in that place. The stamps on his passport show that he left Heathrow Airport in London that same day on an international flight and landed later that evening in Helsinki, Finland. Since there was no direct flight from London to Helsinki during the time that Oswald was in London, Oswald must have changed planes at some city in Europe. The other indication that some people have given is that he must have taken a State Department flight, that there must have been, so some people point to that as an intelligence connection for him, that he actually took some sort of undisclosed flight because there was no direct flight. And he had been taking little hops, and then all of a sudden he ends up in Helsinki before he heads in to Russia. So it makes it sound like he got a job on a freighter. A month later, he's in Russia. But there's a whole series of things that happened there. And either he's incredibly scrappy and able to take money and, conversational knowledge of other languages and work and purchase all sorts of travel, or something else was happening where he was getting help with travel. Regardless, here we go. He has now turned up in Russia, announcing that he wished to give up his American citizenship and become a Russian citizen, which is, of course, called Oswald's Defection. Marguerite Oswald learned of her son's defection when a newspaper reporter called. They said, "Your son's defected to Russia." I told them they were crazy. But then I learned it was true. I couldn't understand it. I can't understand anything. A correspondent named Priscilla Johnson, who was stationed in Moscow when Oswald arrived, remembered him vividly. I will say she is a declared and known CIA asset. She has done writing work for the CIA, and she is one who connected with Oswald immediately. We're about to read about it when he got to Moscow. She also wrote an article about him. She wrote a book with Marina later, and then tried to deny later that she had anything to do with the CIA, even though there was documentation of it. So the fact that she immediately is in touch with him is insightful here. She is a known CIA asset. A correspondent, it says, named Priscilla Johnson told us this. "He was the most interesting defector I ever saw," she said. "Of the 3 or 4 defectors I saw, he was the only ideological one. He talked in terms of capitalists and exploiters, and he said something about he was sure that if he lived in the U.S., he wouldn't get a job, that he'd be one of the exploited. He was like a babe in the woods, a lost child." But there was more to Oswald than that, Miss Johnson found. As I talked to him, I realized he had a sort of vein in him that was beyond reason, maybe that was fanatic. The Russians would not grant Oswald citizenship, but allowed him to stay on as a resident alien. He went to Minsk, and a year and a half later married a pretty, blonde, hazel-eyed, practicing pharmacist named Marina. I didn't realize she was a practicing pharmacist. That's interesting. While he was in Minsk, he wrote a letter that one day would be dug out of his Pentagon files and read again in a new and terrible light. He had learned that his hardship discharge from the Marines had been changed to undesirable because of his defection, and his letter of protest against the action was directed to John Connelly, who he thought was still Secretary of the Navy. There was this key phrase: "I shall employ all means to right this gross mistake or injustice. What's interesting about this particular point, John Connelly, if you remember, we just read some of his articles about a week ago. But he was, of course, the other man shot when JFK was assassinated, and he almost lost his life. And one researcher, Robert Groden, actually has said that he does think it's possible that Oswald had an entirely different motive, which was actually to shoot John Connelly. So that's an interesting thought, because John Connelly had been Secretary of the Navy during the time of Oswald's defection. And so if that was his motive, that would be an interesting one. Well, here we have on this same page, it says 90 minutes after President was shot, detectives wearing 10-gallon hats hustle Oswald in to the Dallas police headquarters. So that's that photo up there. I didn't kill anybody, he insists. And then, of course, we have the famous one below of August 1963, showing Oswald passing out pro-Castro leaflets in New Orleans. Here we have Marguerite. It says, a practical nurse, stout and sorrowing Mrs. Marguerite Oswald, mother of the accused, visits friend and sobs, I'm brokenhearted. He is really a good boy. And then this one says, cradling her daughter Rachel, born 6 weeks ago in Parkland Hospital where Kennedy died. Oswald's Russian wife Marina waits numbly to see her husband. If you look at her face there, look. If you've ever been through great grief or sorrow, you can identify with the look on her face. That moment of shock where things don't fully settle in, you're just numb and exhausted. She must have had a billion thoughts going through her mind at that moment. So we have his letter about John Connelly and to John Connelly. He also joined a rifle club and became an expert marksman. As a Marine, he had made only average scores. He later told a Dallas friend, one of the things I didn't like about Russia was the government wouldn't let you own a rifle, only shotguns. So I joined a rifle club. I had never heard that, had you? That he was part of a rifle club in Russia? He was also distressed about falling hair. He said the cold Russian winters were making him bald. And he found in Russia what he had found in the U.S. He was still an outsider. People mistrusted him. His Russian wife was to recall. We didn't have many friends. He actually discovered himself defending America at some parties and in conversations with fellow workers. Disenchanted, he decided to return to the United States with his wife and the daughter that had been born to them. But he had neither money nor permission. In early 1962, he wrote his mother of his difficulties in getting out. Mrs. Oswald had by that time almost given up on her son. But he asked me to help, she said the other day. And what mother could turn down her son? I went to 12 prominent people in Fort Worth and begged for money, for help, for advice. They said, your son's a communist. We don't want to help him. I said, if a man was drowning, would you help him first or ask his political beliefs? He made a mistake. Now he wants to rectify it. As it has done in many similar cases, the State Department lent Oswald money to get home. And in June 1962, Lee brought his family to Fort Worth, where he joined his mother. He didn't say much about living in Russia, she said. He just introduced his wife and baby and said he wanted to find a job. He had an awful time getting work. People didn't like the idea of him having a Russian wife. They were awful to him and her. Finally, he got a job in a sheet metal factory, I think, but he only stayed a month or so. In late 1962, Lee got a job in Dallas at a photo processing plant. His wife became pregnant again. Now, my understanding is that this photo processing plant was part of the deep state, that they handled classified photography. Lee was fired from his Dallas job in April when his past became known, and he moved his family to New Orleans. It's interesting, the side-by-side comparison of what we're being told versus what is known about Lee Harvey Oswald. Part of what was happening in New Orleans was that he was participating with known CIA people to hand out these leaflets and also do training for guerrilla warfare around Lake Pontchartrain. So he was definitely not just fired for this and went to get a different job there. There was more at work underneath the surface than what anything of this is giving. They took a small apartment and he found a similar job. For the first time in his life, he became politically active. He got involved with the pro-Castro Fair Play for Cuba organization. After a street scuffle with anti-Castro elements, he was fined $10 for disorderly conduct. Later, he appeared on a local TV panel show defending his pro-Castro sentiments. Interesting. By early fall, the Oswalds were broke, and Marina was nearly ready to have their second child. She returned to Texas to stay with friends in Irving, a suburb of Dallas. Lee promised to follow as soon as he was financially able. He said he had other matters to clear up in New Orleans. That's interesting. I mean, the friends were, of course, Michael and Ruth Payne, and she had only met Ruth in February at a party with George de Mohrenschildt. And it seems like Michael and Ruth were handlers for Lee and Marina. And so to call them friends is something quite interesting because they had only known each other for a few months at this point, and it was really just a few meetings throughout the spring. So Marina's in the situation where she's pregnant with their second baby and vulnerable, and then passed off to these friends. Early last month, in the first week of October, Lee appeared in Dallas and telephoned his wife. "I'm going to look for a job and get someplace to live," he told her. "As soon as I'm able, we'll get the family together." He went to a red brick rooming house at 1026 North Beckley Avenue in nearby suburban Oak Cliff and rented a tiny cubicle of a room. He gave his name falsely as O.H. Lee and paid a week's rent, $8, in advance. His room was hardly larger than a closet, and it was furnished sparsely, an iron single bed painted cream with the paint peeling off, a dilapidated dresser, and a closet cabinet. In the month and a half he spent at the rooming house, Lee was quiet and hardly noticed. He left every morning for work. He never told anybody where he worked, his landlady recalled, but he got up, took a bath, and he always washed the tub out, the only guest who did. Some nights he'd come out into the living room and watch TV. Mostly he'd come home from work, make himself a lunch meat sandwich, and lie on his bed reading or writing. Sometimes he'd make a telephone call and we'd hear him talking. It was some foreign language, Russian or German or something. We always wondered who he was talking to. On weekends, Lee would go to Irving and see his wife and his two daughters and his friends, Mike and Ruth Payne. That's the first time I've heard him called Mike. That's interesting. There, he would watch the football game on TV or talk politics. The weekend before last, Lee visited his family in Irving and told them things were finally looking up. Of course, the other interesting part about the Michael and Ruth Payne situation is that they were supposedly split up. So this article is kind of papering over that and pretending like, Michael and Ruth were living there, Marina lived there, Lee would go and they would all talk politics and football and have a good time. It really wasn't like that. Michael wasn't there during these times, is my understanding. The weekend before last, Lee visited his family in Irving and told them things were finally looking up. He told Marina that they would be going out soon to look for an apartment and buy Christmas presents for the children. He lifted up his infant daughter, Rachel, and laughed loudly. When he left to return to his tiny room in another week of work, he seemed in high spirits. That was the last Lee Harvey Oswald's wife saw of him until he was under arrest, charged with the murder of President Kennedy. Well, that's a different description than we've been given. What we had been told previously. I wonder which thing is true, because I've heard from these early reports that he was distant toward her. He was trying to get her to come around, that she wouldn't have anything to do with him that final morning, that he left his money, left his ring, and he seemed heavy and broken. This makes him sound joyful. So that's interesting. That was the last Lee Harvey Oswald's wife saw of him until he was under arrest, charged with the murder of President Kennedy. Which is interesting because he had not been told that he had been charged with that arrest. In his press conference, he said he didn't kill anybody. He said he hadn't been charged with that. Nobody had told him he was accused of that, and that he was a patsy, that he didn't do it. Afterwards, she wept and managed a few words of English. "I love Lee. Lee, good man. He didn't do anything. And his mother pointed at the television set and screamed, "My boy couldn't have killed the president. I know him. Nobody else knows him. He's been persecuted so long." But slowly, methodically, the police were building their case, connecting Oswald with the mail-order purchase of a rifle like the one that fired the fatal bullet, placing him on the scene of the shooting with a long parcel of the size and shape of the rifle. Well, interesting about that is that the mail order purchase that was made was actually, I believe, 5 inches shorter than the one that Lee Harvey Oswald actually had. And neither one was the one that was described when they first got to the window. When they first got to the window and up to the 6th floor, they talked about a Mauser gun. Later, it was changed to become the Mannlicher Carcano. That was the Italian weapon that they said the shots came from. Then they said, comparing his palm marks with the one found on the murder weapon, not found the first day, found after he had passed away, finding traces of burned powder on his hands. That's actually a lie. He passed the paraffin wax test and he had no signs of having fired a weapon that day. Then the police turned up the most damning evidence of all. It was a snapshot of Oswald showing him holding the rifle that apparently was identical with the one that killed the president. Of course, there are problems with that photo. He himself said, "That's not me. They took my face and put it on a different body." There's a lot of discrepancies about that photo. So it's interesting, each piece of the evidence that they point to, that the police had methodically built their case, none of them listed here are accurately described in the way that would actually lead to him being clearly guilty. But before the district attorney of Dallas County could demand the death penalty, Lee Harvey Oswald, who had achieved such horrifying fame, himself was dead. Well, let me know what you thought of that article all about Lee Harvey Oswald, Marina, Marguerite, and the first look that Americans were given at the accused assassin, Lee Oswald. I look forward to hearing your comments below. I think, to me, the most interesting thing is the way that so many facts are presented so clearly within the first week. Deep history about him, his role in Russia, but there's already like CIA fingerprints like Ruth Payne and Priscilla Johnson, and it's very interesting. I think it's also interesting the way that Lee is presented as having had a really joyful visit with Marina, and that she says, "Lee, good, I love Lee. Lee, good man. He didn't do anything." That's her assessment, straight out of the horse's mouth in week 1. Later, she'll change her story, but that's her first assessment, is Lee is a good man. He didn't do anything. Let me know in the comments what you think of this article and the implications that it has for how we look at Lee Harvey Oswald. I can't wait to read your thoughts. Have a great day. Bye.